Good evening, everybody. We are about to start with our today's announced lecture by Professor Ann Cvetkovich, which is the last lecture of the non-formal school on gender, sexuality, culture, and politics being organized by Coalition Margins in Skopje. And the last of the open online lecture series as part of the summer school. I'm Slavcho Dimitrov, one of the organizer of the summer school, and I will be, in the very beginning, briefly introducing Professor Ann Cvetkovich for those who are not well familiarized with her work, although I doubt there are very few of those. And then I will invite Professor Cvetkovich to join us with her talk, which will be not a regular standard talk, but it will experiment with the lecture form itself. So Ann Cvetkovich is currently the director of the Paul and Jewett Institute of Women's and Gender Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. She has been Ellen Clayton Garwood Centennial Professor of English and Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of many books and articles, including Mixed Feelings, Feminism, Mass Culture, and Victorian Sensationalism, An Archive of Feelings, Trauma, Sexuality, and Lesbian Public Culture by Duke 2003, and Depression, a Public Feeling by Duke 2012. She has also co-edited several books, for example, public and general issues such as Public Sentiments, together with Dan Pellegrini, a special issue of the Scholar and Feminist Online, and the book Political Emotions that came out by Routledge in 2010. She has been co-editor with Anne-Marie Jagoz of the GLQ, a Journal of Lesbian and Gay Studies, and her current writing projects focus on the current state of LGBTQ archives and the current use of them by artists to create counter-archives and interventions in the public history. Ann Cvetkovich's work, starting from her first book on mixed feelings, has been highly influential in the understanding of the complex modes of entanglement of affect and politics, and the multiple ways in which affect can work to sustain, stabilize, or resist hegemonic forms of power. Exposing what cannot be rendered visible with the suffering male body in the hidden abode of production in Marxian analysis, affect in Cvetkovich's work contests the dominant hierarchies of suffering and pain, and makes us think feelings as multiple forms in which subjects experience capitalism, and skill feels cultural, structural, and sustained forms of misogyny, homophobia, racism, and other forms of inequalities and violence. Her work has tackled non-normative public cultures and countercultures, organized around experiences of trauma inflicted and suffered in insidious but everyday emotional distress and rhythm, publics that engage and transfigure without denying the traumatic experiences that cannot be recognized nor be dealt with within the hegemonic, extraordinary, privatized, pathologizing, and medicalized models of understanding trauma. The archives of feelings gathered and explored by Ann Cvetkovich in her work demonstrate in persuasive way how different forms of love, rage, depression, grief, shame, or intimacy can provide basis for new queer cultures and world-building projects, and offer directions for different understandings of what politics and political resistance is or might be. This work also challenges the dominant modes in which our understanding of what an archive is, and what constitutes the legitimate and recognizable material of national archives, for example, opening thus venues for unusual and ephemeral archival practices and spaces. Combining memoir and journal of her experience of depression, blockage, being stuck, anxiety, and political hopelessness, with critical essay that contests medical models of understanding and treating depression, Ann Cvetkovich in her book Depression, a Public Feeling writes about depression as a cultural and political phenomenon that underlies our lived experiences of neoliberal capitalism. With a genealogical and historical analysis, Cvetkovich explodes the allegedly universal and trans-historical understanding of depression within the psychiatric and pharmaceutical discourses, and offers accounts of non-conventional archives of feeling bad and despair, including the Cartesian acedia, cultural texts connected to the histories and legacies of slavery and colonialism, and utopian visions and spaces residing in lesbian feminist practices of writing, crafting, and everyday habits and practices. With depression, Cvetkovich prompts us to reconsider the centrality of the somatic, felt, affective, and sensory experiences in political activism and social transformation. Her recent work has also tackled problems related to different performative and art practices that have inspired a new project that aims to articulate notions of sovereignty, democracy, and freedom in affective and sensory terms. Today's presentation by Professor Cvetkovich will draw on her writing that she's been doing over the course of the pandemic in monthly meetings with the Austin, Texas-based Public Feelings Group, whose participants are also in Chicago, Vancouver, Ottawa, and Canada. These short pieces constitute efforts to make sense of what is going on, or just document how it feels, with attention to topics such as COVID silver linings and other pandemic keywords, Zoom-based art and performance, protests under conditions of social distancing, dialectics of hope and despair, Black feminist resources for survival, and other forms of collective care and mutual aid, and the relation between the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic. Through an exploration of the current state of theories of affect and cessation, Professor Cvetkovich will prompt discussion of different connections between how the pandemic feels in Canada or US and how it feels concretely in North Macedonia and the Balkans. I wouldn't take any time longer with the introduction. I would invite Professor Ann Cvetkovich to join us and we can start with the talk. Ann, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Slavcho. Very happy to be here. Thanks to Zoom. Thank you for that introduction, which lays out so much material we could use for further discussion. As you mentioned, what I'm presenting today is work that I have just been doing in the course of the pandemic as a way to make sense of what's going on. It feels very context specific. So it's interesting to be able to share it with this particular audience. I guess I'm not seeing who's here, right? The participants list is...
no, the audience is following just online.
Yeah, which is fine, it's fine. I've just also been very interested, maybe we'll get into the question of the commons and the virtual commons in how it is that we create collectivity and community. So sometimes we're just kind of staring into the screen. I'm also looking out my window in Ottawa, but trying to make a connection across the distance. It's very special to me actually to be speaking to people based, or to think of my audience as based in Skopje and in what's now North Macedonia. And thanks to Slavcho, your wonderful hosting and previous occasions, I've had the opportunity to visit Skopje and also Belgrade. And so I do feel like this event today is a way to continue those conversations across those distances. Just as a way to kind of perhaps give you some sense of where I'm speaking from today, literally. I have a PowerPoint, which I'm going to try to go to now. And I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement, which is one of the new conventions here in Canada. But I have to find the PowerPoint. We practiced before we began, and to go there. It seems to have closed. Sorry, I'm getting there. Let's see. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, so if you were here in Ottawa with me for this event, it would be quite likely that the event would begin with a land acknowledgement in which I would explain to you that we're on the unceded and traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples, and that we try to pay attention to the many histories that have led to the theft of that land and the presence of often settler colonials of European origin, as I am. And in fact, part of my heritage is in the Balkans, Croatia, what's now known as Croatia, with also family from Serbia. And I just note that this is one of the few places where my introducer doesn't have to have anxiety about how to pronounce my name, and probably pronounces it better than I do. So I have been had a personal interest in travel in the Balkans. And so I'm asking myself today, what would land acknowledgement look like there? Because in many ways, the notion of settler colonialism, indigenous peoples, and land acknowledgement is a very North American concept. And yet at the same time, the Balkans, I think of as I've come to know it, and it's actually taken some work to come to know it, whether in books or through travel, because it is a very neglected terrain in most global histories. It is basically the stomping ground for many different peoples traveling. I mean, most recently, refugees from Syria crossing lands and hitting borders, including in North Macedonia, in their efforts to get to a so-called Europe further to the north or further to the west. So if we were to think land acknowledgement in Macedonia, I think we would have to think about histories of so-called ancient Greece, histories of the Roman Catholic and Byzantine Empire, of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, communism, and the borders of a former Yugoslavia, and then the breakup and brokenness is one concept I know you've been working with. And so I think of brokenness as perhaps context specific as well. So what does it mean to have the quote unquote Balkanization, the way in which actually the region has become the name for a particular kind of geopolitical mode of transformation. So the splitting up of the larger Yugoslavia into smaller nation states and the modes of precarity that has produced. Even since I was there in 2015 in Skopje, the name of Macedonia has changed. And so there's so much to say about that. So I just wanted to nod about that, because this place-based work in terms of this question of how are we feeling now is very important. So there's not much about Macedonia in the news. And I was asking Slavcho, how does the pandemic feel there? So what I have to say to you about how it feels here may be completely out of context, or it is in some way. So I'm very interested perhaps in the discussion to be able to say more about that. Just a little bit more about where I'm from. And again, I have been learning and unlearning, in part because of the decolonial work here in Canada, but also because I'm a recent returnee. So I spent the better part of my adult life and my career in the US, and just in the last not quite 2 years, most of which has been lived under pandemic conditions. I returned to Canada, to Ottawa, which is the capital of the country, not a place I have lived before, and certainly the seat of quite a spectacle of the history of British colonialism in the form of the Victorian architecture of our Parliament buildings, the building of a canal that Ottawa is very proud of, that was part of a military and security effort to ensure that free passageway for goods would be possible for the settlers here who were living in fear of US invasion. And now the confluence of rivers where I live is the home to various efforts to decolonize or transform or rename the landscape. So we too, here in Canada, live in a space of constant evolution of names and efforts to change names in order to decolonize, in order to return, in some cases, to Indigenous languages. There are tremendous revitalization efforts to try to bring back Indigenous languages, both for Indigenous people and for settlers. So this is this slide here is part of a mural project for National Indigenous Peoples Day, which is now celebrated in Canada on June 21st. It's a relatively new holiday. And I've been very interested in this issue of self-care. I'll probably say more about it later, the way in which activist self-care has been very prominent recently in the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, and with a very direct debt to Audre Lorde, who talks about caring for oneself as an act of political rebellion or resistance. And so I found very interesting this public mural project on resilience, which uses the native Cree term. I don't know how to pronounce it, but I'll just make my best effort. Oh, I see Lauren is trying to get in. You could, I guess I'm a co-host, so. Taking care of oneself in the Cree, Nakati Yemisawan, is described as moments between actions, the times of rest and reflection that remind us of what we are fighting for. I find this very interesting as a statement of public feelings in the town I'm living in, as a way of claiming space and also indigenizing the concept of taking care of oneself. And the project is, here's just, oops. Sorry, I'm trying to move to the next slide. It's a mural project in an underground pedestrian tunnel near the river with various Indigenous artists. So again, I just wanted to show that in order to give you some sense of where I'm speaking to you from and what is informing some of my thinking about my feelings, as they consist also of an attempt to engage with the environment around me. And I again invite your comments. Slavcho, maybe you'll be able to kind of, I don't know, start us off on this in the Q&A of you know, sort of what's happening where you are. So as we said in the intro, some of the pieces, oh, I see Lauren there. Some of the pieces that I am reading from today come out of work that I've done in these monthly episodes with my public feelings group in Austin. This has been one way that I have been able to connect with my former home that I've not been able to visit, and some of the scholars with whom I have been able to work over time. Lauren Berlant among them, who I know has visited you recently, and in my reference to our locations in variously Austin, Ottawa, Vancouver, and Chicago, the person in Chicago is Lauren herself. So some of you know me from the collaboration I did with Karen Michalski, Alphabet of Feeling Bad, that was part of the public exhibition that Slavcho curated earlier this fall. It's a project that, although it was made in 2012, continues to, or is listed as 2013 here, we did the filming in 2012, has continued to stay with me and been a kind of site of, or point of departure for talks and workshops of various kinds, where I like to ask myself and my audience, you know, are we feeling bad now? And if so, what are those versions of feeling bad like? And sometimes the prompt I give to people when I do, you mentioned that I wanted to play a bit with the lecture format, and I will have some pauses where I will encourage you to write or make notes. And actually this also is a bit of a nod to Lauren and also Katie Stewart for the lecture workshop format, where we have been trying to experiment with ways in which lecture and writing practice could be combined within the context of a more conventional event. So one of my perennial prompts, especially in small workshops, is to ask people, how does it feel it is a little bit of a riff on Bob Dylan, but I like the it, right? Like what is the it? Variously defined. So I just listed some possible its that we could be thinking about. And again, if you want to be doodling or scratching or note-taking as I talk, you could certainly take any number of these questions as a prompt for yourself. So how does capitalism feel right now? How does systemic racism feel right now? How does the afterlife of colonialism feel right now? For those of you living in the geographic precincts of the former Yugoslavia, how does the afterlife of communism feel right now, or socialism? How does it feel to be queer? How does it feel to be a survivor, variously understood? How does it feel to be living on? This is a concept that Lauren's been working on as well, to live on in the face of disaster. And I think all of these questions are always relevant for me. They're ones I'm always asking myself, but particularly in this time of pandemic, they acquire a particular kind of urgency or connotation. That means that the answer you give to these questions today might be different than the answer you would have given a year ago. On the other hand, I think we are simply living in conditions that were already produced for us before the onset of this particular medical pandemic. So it may be that the answer is no different than it would have been a year ago. So again, Alphabet of Feeling Bad continues to be useful. So I was pleased to see, Slavcho, that you had chosen to include it in the exhibition, and anything you might want to say, or others in the Q&A about sort of how it reads, how it read in September 2020, again, in pandemic conditions, would be very interesting to me. This is the text from the audio recording version of the piece. And certainly too, it's been an ongoing inspiration for me insofar as the abecedary is, I think, an interesting genre for generating keywords of various kinds. So it's very capacious. It can be, again, in terms of like the constant renaming of places, we can also constantly return to this repetitive practice of being able to say, you know, what is my A word today? What is my B word today? What do some of these different words from this project, grief, dread, feeling bad, loneliness, and so on, what do they feel like, or what would be my felt definition of them in this moment? The point being that even for the concepts that were more specific categories coming out of affect theory, such as something like Heather Love's Feeling Backward, even if those were concepts that belong to particular theoretical idioms, their meanings can be constantly renegotiated through these kinds of conversations. So I did want to reference that as another, I think, background for my ongoing writing and thinking practice, or my thinking practice as a writing practice. Also been inspired, you know, if you've read Depression, you know that Linda Berry has been a point of inspiration for me. One thing about being able to do Zoom lectures from your home is that you can just pull books off the shelves. So I was being very quick with my my PowerPoint, so I don't have any images here. But here's an example. And again, this, I have no idea whether and how Linda Berry's work transfers or translates, literally and figuratively, to the Macedonian context, but she's definitely important to me. And what I'm going to try to do now, we were experimenting with this beforehand, so Slavcho, please do unmute yourself to help me if I don't get this quite right. But I really liked this pandemic diary project that appeared in the New York Times in May 2020. So I'm going to try to show it to you in a moment. But some of its structuring questions or its writing prompts. And again, I invite you at any time to just start scrawling on a piece of paper in response to any of these prompts as I'm talking. How did then become now? When did this become real for you? Begin at the beginning, spiral your way in. And she's very interested in the combination of writing and drawing, in part in order to keep the hand moving on the page in the same way that one does for you know, a kind of free writing practice. So let's see if I can. So what did we decide, Slav? Are you seeing it now on the screen?
It's
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly scroll, and again, I assume people can Google these things for themselves, but just so you get a sense of the visual, here's some of the spirals, and let's hope it will feed. It's having to probably work a little bit. Yeah, so here's begin at the beginning, spiral your way in. And she says, before I begin writing, I set a timer for 2 minutes and I draw a slow, tight spiral. And I let my mind's eye drift to scenes that come back to me when I think about what started to change, what became important, where was I? What was I doing? I just draw the spiral and drift. And I have actually found that to be a very useful exercise that I have done with some of my different writing partners. Linda Berry's also very, if you read more about her practice, she draws heavily on a stage of her work in which you make lists of things. And so I have found that list making to be a really productive way of working, and you'll see how it comes up in some of the pieces today that deal with performance and with protests. So now I'm going to try to go back. How do I do that? I have to try to get back to my PowerPoint. Now I'm in Safari. I think perhaps if I just quit Safari. Are you seeing the PowerPoint now? Yeah. Yes. Okay, great. Okay, so I wanted to start with one of the first of these pieces, which is on the pandemic keyword COVID silver linings, which very quickly seemed to become a meme in the early world of the pandemic in March and April. So this dates from early April, from a first meeting of our little writing group. And I tried to just throw together some stuff for you to see, especially because I'm aware that many of you are listening in English, perhaps not your first language. So there's a lot of proper names, and I'll be trying to put some of them up here on the screen. But maybe you could just be thinking about what your pandemic keywords are. I wonder if in Macedonia they're the same as they are here, and also for keywords, language is very important, and translation is very important. So a lot of these are quite idiomatic expressions in English, so I always find it interesting to see whether and how they translate. So I don't know if like, what would COVID silver linings be in your language? I'm asking you because I want to know before I proceed.
Yeah, that's precisely what I was thinking now. Maybe, I don't know, maybe some analytical translation. I'm not sure that we have some analog phrase or syntagm for this.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, right? So maybe we'll think about that. Okay, here's a few things to think with. And now I will actually read a little bit. So again, this is from April 2020. I think the timing is very important for how things have shifted rapidly or not, month by month, which has been one of the amazing things about our public feelings group, is the chance to meet monthly and to have that seriality and continuity. All right, COVID silver linings has rapidly become a new meme or hashtag and is directly related to my work on dialectics of hope and despair, pessimism and utopia, positive and negative affects. The phrase also takes me back to Marxist thinking about capitalism as sowing the seeds, or we could say the viruses, of its own destruction and bringing into being possibilities for liberation. For him specifically, the conditions of factory production brought workers together in ways that could enable gatherings for purposes of political revolt, such as unions and strikes. Even without the new protocols of social distancing, that version of public gatherings seems to have withered considerably under current regimes. Although there are some persistent traces here in Canada. That's like a little inside joke about the persistence of union culture in Canada versus the US, a small but significant difference. And again, this is where comparison across borders, particularly with the states of the former Yugoslavia, would be very interesting. Another good example for me is John D'Amelia's hypothesis about capitalism and gay identity and how urban settlements and war enabled people to leave their families and circulate in new and different ways that allowed more flexible intimacies such as same-sex cruising and cohabitation. It's interesting, yeah.
Someone wrote in the comments and luckily noticed that your battery on the laptop is on 10%. So you should maybe just double check it in case.
Thank you.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, I do have it plugged in, and I think it must suck battery power to do these talks. I did, it was at 30 when I started. It is plugged in. That's funny that you could see that. So hang on. Yeah, we'll just, perhaps that person can keep track of my battery power. I did an event in Brazil a few weeks ago where I ended up on my iPhone, like having to make the crossover. So we'll see what happens. I can also switch to my iPad if need be. So, all right, I am going to slow down though. I know I'm reading fast. All right, so capitalism's socialist silver linings has to do with people gathering together to create publics of various kinds, including intimate and affective ones. How might the COVID silver lining that is a function of social distance be not just about alternate socialities, but also about the asocial or antisocial, the retreat, the withdrawal, and even the refusal or rejection? Hashtag together apart also seems to be making the rounds in this vein, with emphasis on the together in spite of being apart, injecting a hopeful note. But I'm reminded of Douglas Crimp's formulation, coming together to stay apart, in reference to his work on Andy Warhol and Ron Tavel's collaborations in film, which retains a bit more of the antisocial spirit in describing cultural formations that include isolation or separation. It comes from the big queer debate about the antisocial, which I have sort of tagged here in terms of a bibliographic cluster, where often Bersani and Edelman, Leo Bersani, that is, I didn't include him here, but he would be an important reference, particularly Is the Rectum a Grave? Got lined up against Jose Munoz and Jack Halberstam. And then I think Lauren actually occupies, it's so interesting, Lauren, to be seeing your face while I'm saying this, I think Lauren's work is, it doesn't quite fit into one side or the other of this so-called debate, but it perhaps exists somewhere in between, or also provides us a way to think synthetically about the structuring of that discussion of the social antisocial. As those who might be struggling with new forms of domesticity, especially it seems to me, parents left to home alone with kids and also trying to work, the dream of one big happy family actually includes plenty of trouble and bad shit, especially in our most intimate relations, as the critique of compulsory heterosexuality or the stats on a current rise in domestic violence would confirm. So Together Apart, like COVID silver linings, needs to cut both ways and retain the aura or specter of negativity. For me personally, with the privileges of a salaried job that is not in jeopardy, existing home office and no kids, COVID silver linings is a real thing. I am so happy to be working at home, especially after months of the forced march of the 9 to 5 in my current administrative job. Even though I'm actually far less productive at the office and waste a lot of time on the labor of commuting, which includes not only the time spent getting there, but the time spent getting dressed, packing lunch, leaving the house in order, etc. I really hate it. And one reason I got into the academic biz was to avoid it, especially because I'm now back in Canada. I'm reminded of the dreary routines of childhood, and I wonder if the negative associations have to do with Toronto winters or being a latchkey kid or other low-level forms of feeling bad or depression. Even if we are aware of the class privileges of hashtag WFH, working from home, as a COVID silver lining, and the class and racial critiques are quickly emerging, I still want to go on record as saying that the step back from ordinary routines of work and workaholism have been a welcome break and an important form of refusal for me. I've also been thinking about COVID silver linings at a more meta-theoretical level in terms of dialectics of the positive and negative. Is our need to find a silver lining a form of cruel optimism, to invoke Lauren Berlant? Is it like the pink ribbon culture of warriors and survivors that surrounds cancer treatment in the US, part of the American need to put a happy face on everything? As we know from our public feelings field tank explorations, the shared collectivity of political depression, for example, is forged out of impasse, numbness, and despair. At the same time, it has been important in recent weeks to forge resources of hope, which include the creative activities and the resting that I have seen. There are some interesting strategies of survival and resilience and working together that qualify as COVID silver linings. Indeed, there is an optimism in the belief that social distancing will make a difference, and adherence to it is dependent on staving off the seductive pull of the death drive of risky behavior that I am familiar with from HIV/AIDS activisms, an important backstory for public feelings work. We refuse to pathologize those who engage in risky behaviors. While we might develop strategies for safer social distancing, like we did for safer sex, we also know that some will be less quote unquote compliant due to despair, addiction, lack of economic and material resource. And still, the queer utopian in me wants to see the gay choreographers put in charge of the dance of social distancing as we figure out new ways to move together in space with our gloves and our masks, taking on as our partner, Miss Rona, with her fabulous red clusters and crowns. Okay, that's that one. So that was April. You know what I was getting, Slavcha, we didn't talk about this in the preamble, but something I've been doing, especially in context of translation, is just to have a 1 minute screen break. So I'm kind of liking the fade out before we go to the next episode. So I'm gonna just turn off my camera for 1 minute and mute, and then I'll come back to you, okay? And if people wanna draw spirals or write down your pandemic keywords, that's great, okay? So. Okay, I'm back. But I need to know, are you seeing screen share or not?
Yes.
You are?
Yes. Maybe before we continue, just a reminder for everybody following us that they can write, that everybody can write their questions or comments that they want us to engage with after your talk. So just a reminder, so please continue.
Yeah. So let's see. So you're seeing Performance in a Time of Miss Rona? Okay. So this was in May, and I didn't have time to put up images, but this was one of the ones for which I started by making a list of all of the performances that I was seeing via Zoom, and also the mechanism. So I suddenly found myself using Instagram significantly for the first time, and also being really interested in what people were doing via Instagram TV. I don't think I'm going to take the time to click on these, but two people, if you don't know them, super want to recommend them. And fortunately, there is a lot that's available to you, whether online or through Instagram at MixViv. So Justin Vivian Bond, and also Paul Swallow, who's my dear friend from Austin, who now lives in New York, often works with Viv, and has a persona named Christine. So I'll just read a couple of the little segments that I wrote for the question of performance.
And dear, once again, the battery is at 4%. So
Okay.
might lose the connection. Maybe you should just double check it.
Yeah. Strange. To the best of my knowledge, it's working. Let's see. Strange. It's funny because your viewers can more easily see than I can what's going on. Let's see. I'm going to just end show. Yeah. Well, just keep trying, Slavcho, and then if I have to switch to my iPad, I'll do that, because I don't see how to plug any differently. I'll try one more thing. I will try a different outlet. All right, I'll make the most of my 4%. Yeah, just a little bit about Justin and Christine. I first became aware that performance by social distance was going to become a thing via some of my favorite drag queen friends, Paul Swallow and Justin Vivian Bond, who almost immediately took to Instagram Live with little at-home videos that were funny, bitchy, campy. Stuck in his apartment in New York City, Paul sometimes appeared as his alter ego, Hollywood-style starlet Rebecca Havemeyer, and Christine, the drug-addled gender bender from deep Louisiana. But he also showed up as plain old big-hearted Paul with his cat Tickles Pickles. He is close friends with Viv, who fled to her upstate home from where her diva persona, Anti-Glam, has been giving tutorials on Rona-themed cocktails in preparation for little Thursday evening soirees, where she sings a few thematically appropriate tunes, such as David Bowie's Space Oddity or Exhuma's 21st Century. Just as V's performances as both Kiki and Justin Vivian Bond have saved me emotionally on numerous occasions, so too is Anti-Glam helping me survive the pandemic with both laughter and tears. And again, I just highly recommend that you Google while I talk to see these folks. And then a couple of others, Dorian Wood, who did an amazing, who has a version of Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation, which is just an incredible mashup of performances, time frames, you know, the 80s speaking to the 2020s and so on. And Dorian also does amazing work with sort of presenting. They go by both pronouns, gender nonconforming, fat Latinx body for a particular of intransigent spectacle of the body on Instagram, but also live. And again, some of this is this sort of wistfulness, or the loss of performance, the loss of travel, which reminds me also of the kind of grief that Douglas Crimpt writes about in A Time of AIDS, that is mourning not just those dying, but mourning the capacity to have unprotected sex or to fuck with, you know, Crisco as opposed to other kinds of lube, that all of these things count as forms of loss. So the way in which through our, you know, access to each other, even in circumstances like today, is also tinged with what it might mean if we were in spaces together, is to me very poignant and remains so. So just a little bit about, let's see. It's been very interesting to me to think about what happens to liveness. So how are we using the chats, or how are people staging performances in particular ways that can replicate liveness? So the intimacy of Dorian performing his Janet Jackson show in his living room at his home in Los Angeles did feel like a kind of connection. And then also important for me are some of the performances that Toshi Regan has done of it, or in relation to her work with Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And that's been a slightly different approach to performance in a time of pandemic, where Toshi has been able to rescreen a recording of an early version of Parable of the Sower, actually at NYU Abu Dhabi. There's some complicated politics there, but they were a major sponsor of an early workshop version of the work, which was also recorded. And so they have, that video is very tightly circumscribed in terms of its circulation. The Butler estate has mandated that it can't be shown except in one-off performances. So it's not just something you can access on YouTube. So Toshi, in the pandemic times, set up some different screenings followed by live Q&As. So I thought that was an interesting approach to the question of how to move between live performance and Zoom. Probably in the pause, I might click on this little 40-second clip. We were experimenting with it beforehand, but I'll just read you a little bit about that, and then that'll be the end of this segment. So I'd been longing to see Parable of the Sower, so access to it in any form was another so-called silver lining. I was in the middle of another Earth Day live stream when I got word that it was on, so only saw the final songs. Toshi's rocked out version of God is Change, Change is God, and Bernice's finale rendition of the actual Parable of the Sower from the Bible. Even in mediated form, it was incredible, maybe because the staging is minimal and the songs are so strong, and also because I've been thinking about the book a lot over these past months. The closest to an actual live show was Dorian Wood's performance of their cover version of Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation, which I have also not had a chance to see live. It's a slow, dark, sad rendition of the songs, playing up the lyrics so as to underscore their political meanings, and a good choice for the present moment. Dorian was alone in their house, broadcasting live, and the intimacy of his big body and his big heart performing those songs was almost as good as a live show. And again, this is kind of an ongoing series, and I'm sure you all could do the same. That is to just list almost diary-like some of the different performance moments that you've experienced in this time of pandemic, and that might be another thing we could discuss in the Q&A. I think I'm gonna do another 1 minute pause, and then I'm gonna do one more on the politics of protest, and then we can open it up from there. So I'm just gonna turn off again for 1 minute. I'm back. It looks like I'm charging up too, which is great. It must have been something to do with the plug I was using. I'm not sure what that is, but that's good news. And now, are you seeing Cultures of Protest on the screen? Okay, great. So this is episode number 3, and this was in the beginning of June, by which point streets in the US and really all over the world, and again, I would be very interested to see how this was playing out, if at all, where you are, was coming out to protest the death, murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, but also systemic racism. And in fact, one of my recurring questions now, as I continue to think about the issue of COVID silver linings, is will the uprisings against systemic racism turn out to be the most important COVID silver lining, if there is one? So as part of my interest in these questions of the social, we might also, especially since Lauren's here, talk about the question of the commons, and also as reading, had you look at this now finally published work of Jose Muñoz's on the Brown Commons. I've just been very interested over time in cultures of protest as means of public gathering. What is the relation between protest and performance, which has been, I think, of ongoing interest in queer politics, right? The notion of protest as performative and what it means to exploit the performative power of protest. This is something that ACT UP did very cannily. It's also at the heart of the Chicago Field Tank's work on political depression, is to think about ways of staging, for example, the International Day of the Politically Depressed in a way that also plays with the the performative politics of protest. So as one of the list-making prompts that I worked with, again, I've got a few different writing partners, and one of them, we did start with making a list of memorable protests that we had attended, as a way of thinking about protests in the streets. I was having a lot of, again, this is an idiomatic term from English, FOMO or FOMS, fear of missing out or fear of missing something. You know, when everyone's at the party and you're not there. So particularly because of the closed border between the US and Canada, I was really feeling like I wanted to be on the streets in the US, preferably in New York, but also Austin. And here I was in Canada, where there were protests also going on, and I was able to go to one fairly modest one in Ottawa, which I was happy about. But yeah, I was kind of, you know, kind of stuck imagining protests to which I have been, and then trying to think about that in the context of the, you know, greatest moment of social uprising or social protest in the US since the 1960s. Really remarkable. And it was, in fact, that culture of protest that sent me across the border to the US at the tender age of 18. So cultures of protest, let's see. So I'm actually going to take you to Stonewall 50 and the Queer Liberation March counter-protest in New York last year in 2019. So this one goes, call me a thrill seeker, but I wish I were in the streets right now. I'm reading other people's eyewitness reports. On the ground accounts are the only ones I trust right now, because media coverage of protest is always terrible or inadequate, even when it's a peaceful protest. In another of his long Facebook posts, Jim Farrat, Stonewall and ACT UP veteran, frequent and sometimes infuriating provocateur, writes about how he heard people from his apartment in New York City and was drawn ineluctably into the crowd. He wore a mask, maintained social distance, and eventually got tired out. But as he put it, he had to march. And so do I. I almost don't care where, but if I could go anywhere, it would probably be New York. I happened to be there in September for the climate change march and wept a bit when I arrived downtown to an outpouring of kids with their amazing signs. It was crowded, but not claustrophobic. And I was also there last summer for Stonewall 50. Even though there were naysayers, I loved it. Not the big march, but the hopping between the transgender march and the drag march on Friday, the Dyke March on Saturday, and then the counter protests the next morning, just before and alongside the official march. And I'll just shoot through a few slides from that counter march. And especially if we do talk about Jose, here's one of the signs for and to him at the start of that march. And then there was ACT UP New York contingent, and then the march ended as historically the Gay Pride March used to do in New York on the Great Lawn in Central Park with a bit of a rally. The sign, I don't know if you would be able to read it, says, "None are free until all are free." I spent the weekend trying to figure out the relation between the queer 90s and the current moment, more so than reflecting on the events of 1969. I actually wrote something about the rally in Central Park and its relation to ACT UP, which I've been thinking about this past week because Larry Kramer was there for one last hurrah. Larry Kramer, one of the founding members of ACT UP and also of Gay Men's Health Crisis, who died, I think, a few days before George Floyd. And I think his death was somewhat eclipsed by that. But in my view, Larry was totally upstaged by the next generation of Indigenous, disabled, trans, immigrant, and BIPOC activists. In fact, many of the same kinds of activists who are at the forefront of what's going on now. but I would say too that this 1990s moment that's very important to me was also present. Marga Gomez was the MC, Justin Vivian Bond, who I mentioned earlier, performed. Also Kevin Aviance, who's one of the performers that Jose Munoz writes about, gave an amazing, very brief performance. One difference since Stonewall 25 is the centrality of anti-racism to queer organizing. We've come a long way in 25 years, but not far enough yet, as we are seeing now in incendiary uprisings that are so different in mood from a celebratory march. I've been thinking about those moments when the adrenaline is running. This is kind of a thing I'd be interested in, is just like, what is the sensation of protest, the embodied sensation of it? Or when, as my friend Lakin, who lives in Minneapolis and was dealing with the incredible street world there in Minneapolis, including the National Guard being present on the streets. So they referred to it as what happens when the juice is in the system. I'm reminded of the feel of more small-scale protests, like anti-apartheid actions at Cornell, which is where I went to grad school back in the 1980s, when I was ready to get into it with the police just for trying to keep us to one lane of traffic. Or the opening scene from the Depression journals, in which I sprained my ankle because I was so upset about seeing students arrested on campus just for making a shantytown. More recently, at a gun-free UT rally we had in Texas just before I left. Oh, I remember talking about this in Belgrade in 2017, that we'd been working very hard on legislation that made it legal for people to carry concealed weapons on the campus at the University of Texas. At a rally there, I got really angry about the white dude counter-protesters edging to the front of an otherwise pretty harmless rally on the campus. I moved up close to one of them and asked him to please step back or leave, and I could feel the potential for violence in my veins. I love the feel of an unruly, spontaneous march. The first Dyke March in Washington, D.C. in 1993, the first queer bomb in Austin about 10 years ago, the night of Wendy Davis's filibuster for abortion rights at the state capitol in Austin. I've also been in New York City for rowdier moments, Zuccotti Park during Occupy, and at least one nighttime march against anti-Black racism where the streets felt edgy and tense. What would I do right now? Where would I be? I'm not sure, but I really want to be on a street somewhere, especially after close to 3 months of sheltering at home in relative isolation. Even 6 feet apart from others, I want to feel the energy of trying to change things, the potential cocktail of feelings channeled into the movement of running in the streets. I confess that I'm a protest chaser. After the Stonewall 50 countermarch, some of us weren't quite ready to go home. So we took the train from Central Park downtown to the West Village and stood at the historic corner of Christopher Street and 7th Avenue, across from the Stonewall Inn, watching an endless parade of corporate floats pressing on amidst the debris on the street. After about an hour, too tired to go to a club to dance, I walked home across the village where crowds of young queer, Black, and brown kids were partying in the streets, making the space their own. I was glad to think they might be the future, and I hope this season of protest proves me right. So that's, I wanted to show you this one because it has Klaus Nomi alongside of, many versions of, say, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who have become sort of the iconic faces of LGBTQ rights at this point in the US. And then I have a COVID silver linings take too, but I think I'm gonna stop there. Just go back to this one. And we can open it up for discussion.
Yep, thank you, Anne, for this. And stopping now with the protest image with Jose Esteban Munoz image on it. I was also thinking, and while you also mentioned him during your talk, on how also this experience, or how can we think pandemic, COVID silver lining in terms of the possibilities and the cracks it opens for rethinking the commons in general, and in particular going back and referring to Jose's latest work that has been posthumously published, The Sense of Brown. Maybe just for a beginning, while you were talking, I also went through one quote from the book. Maybe if you're okay, I can if you're okay with that, I can read it, and maybe we can also respond on how we can think the commons, especially through these affective sensorial experiences which are being shared now across many dividing or across many identity lines, but also how those lines are being drawn again in terms of inequality of access to opportunities among different populations. So this is actually the very beginning of The Sense of Brown, and the text actually, The Brown Commons by Munoz. Brown commons is meant to signify at least two things. One is the commons of brown people, places, feelings, sounds, animals, minerals, flora, and other objects. How these things are brown, or what makes them brown, is partially the way in which they suffer and strive together, but also the commonality of their ability to flourish under duress and pressure. They're brown in part because they have been devalued by the world outside their commons. Their brownness can be known by tracking the ways through which global and local forces constantly attempt to degrade their value and diminish their worth. But they are also brown insofar as they smolder with a life and persistence. They're brown because brown is a common color shared by a commons that is of and for the multitude. This is the other sense of brown that I wish to describe. People and things in the commons I'm rendering are brown because they share an organism that is not solely the organic of the natural, as much as it is certain brownness, which is embedded in a vast and a pulsating social world. Again, not organic like a self-sufficient organism, but organic in that the world is brown as the objects within the world touch and are co-present. The brown commons is not about the production of the individual, but instead about a movement, a flow, and an impulse to move beyond the singular subjectivity and the individualized subjectivities. It is about the swerve of matter, organic and otherwise, about the moment of contact and the encounter and all that it can generate. Brownness is about contact and is nothing like continuousness. Brownness is a being with, being alongside. The story I'm telling about A Sense of Brown is not about the formation of atomized brown subjects. It is instead about the task, the endeavor, not of enacting a brown commons, but rather of knowing a brownness that is our commonality. Furthermore, the brownness that we share is not knowable in advance. It is not reducible to one object or thing, so the commons of brownness is not identifiable as any particular thing we have in common. So this.
Thank you for reading that.
I've been thinking also a lot about this very beginning of this text in particular, but it is also in the editing of the book. But it had been set at the very beginning of the sense of Brown, and how it opens possibilities by setting the affective experience and how power has been sensed across brown people, but also queer people as well, how this degrading, devaluing, this deprivation of life worlds and the possibilities of building world projects actually marks what can we call the brown commons, or I would even call it the queer commons, but also the possibilities that arise out of these experiences that go beyond any identity containments. So maybe also, I don't know, what do you think, but how can we actually think in terms of pandemic silver lining on how it opened possibilities for rethinking what is common? What can we think as the common now at this point, especially in times of extreme exposure and of extreme vulnerability, of this experience of brokenness, of broken material worlds and broken temporalities, if you like, but also how people have been materially and economically affected, how many people have been left with jobs, and this vulnerability has been even more significantly brought to light across differentially across different populations. And what can we, how can we think what the commons is beyond the standard object or property or even common property related notions of the commons. I don't know if it makes any sense, but I don't know, maybe in general you can refer, because I also want us to pay jointly tribute to the work of Jose Esteban Munoz, whose thinking has been so I don't know, engaging for all of us.
Yeah, and I was happy to have you read it out loud, because it's sort of another equivalent of pausing my screen just to kind of, hear those words wash over me. And I will say too, I realized I corresponded with you a few weeks ago, and we agreed on some readings that we would, assign, or I don't know how you're treating this, as maybe a seminar for some people. And then I realized I didn't have time to reread it for today. So this is kind of where we go into seminar world, just, being honest. And except it's almost like some of that work on the commons is very embedded in my thinking over time, from, among other things, having hosted Jose for a version of a talk that became that material on the Brown Commons, and because he was writing it up until the last minute, he had me print it out for him on my printer. So hence I had it on my desktop. So I have, kind of a manuscript version that I have read multiple times. And then I'm kind of, what I'm getting at too is the geological layers of these forms of thinking and thinking with people over time. So here I am still thinking with or alongside of Jose, and it's odd that my screen has, your image, mine, version of Lawrence, who just has her picture up, and then Jose's picture, right? So what is the dialogue that is being created there? I don't actually have the book in my hand yet, because it's hard to get US books in Canada. So I didn't end up getting it. And so I haven't, it's interesting to hear sort of the published version as you read it out loud, of a certain version of what the Brown Commons might be. Hearing you read it, where I'm wanting to go first in this kind of seminar type conversation, is actually to focus on the Brown in Brown Commons. So to leave aside a little bit the question of the Commons, and to ask what happens when we think brownness, which is one of the key projects for the book, the Sense of Brown, a book that I actually, or a project that I lived with for a very long time, going back to some of the earliest work of Jose's that produced that book, which is his notion of feeling brown. In the work of Luis Alfaro. I think that's one of the earliest essays from the book, where what he was trying to do was to think about race in affective terms. So race not as an identity, but as an affect. I find that contribution of the project to be a very powerful one. For those of us who are interested in affect. And I do find it very interesting that he came to that specifically out of the project of trying to think Brown or Latinx identities. So I think of that as also, and I'm very between places. That's why I started with place in my talk today, and then keep kind of referencing what I think your place is, or wanting you to tell me, sort of how these ideas are working for you in your context, is I find it very interesting. I'm sure the book will get a lot of circulation. I'm really wondering because I sometimes find it interesting to see what those in, let's say, a broadly construed Europe make of US race relations and understandings of critical race theory, systemic racism that often can be too crudely divided between black and white. So one of the other really important interventions of Jose's work more generally and Sensa Brown in particular was to try to think questions, say, of the commons or questions of racial identity from the perspective of Brown Latinx experiences, and then to bring us to affect for that reason. So then the commons becomes a category that for me is very intimately linked to questions of affect and the social. This is a discussion actually that Lauren and I have been having in and through some of the work that she has been doing on the commons concept. And I think we are both in agreement about the commons for me anyway, but I hear Lauren saying the same thing, as a kind of placeholder for the desire for the social. So again, across my critical lifetime, I've seen many terms function as the name for the social. And subculture's been very important. Publics and counterpublics has been very important. The commons seems to be one of the next vocabulary terms to come along, to be trying to do a certain work to name a feeling of, say, being together, right? Then, to my mind, one of the things that Lauren contributes so powerfully to the discussion is the focus on not just the antisocial, but this notion of the unbearable, the non-sovereign, as a way of explaining, in her words, the inconvenience of others. So I think the vocabulary is important because they start to kind of thicken the texture of these theoretical categories that can be too big. Again, this is where I feel like for me, the public feelings work tries to dial it down and start to think like, how does it actually feel on the ground, and to pay attention to these nuances of the complexity and the messiness of the social. Jose is often construed, like through Cruising Utopia, for example, as it's sort of tending more in the direction of, and I think I do too, in this account, for example, of this particular march in New York last year, of the joy of being with others in these forms of protest and performance. But it's always messy, and the brownness also is a reminder of, as you highlighted for us in your reading of that passage, of devaluation but I mean, it's a beautiful passage in terms of the specificity of the language that is used to describe the devaluing of things that are brown. And so there I want to really not too quickly substitute the queer for the brown, but actually to pay attention to, how is it that, that people are being shot on the border that I just came from, of the US and Mexico, for example. And this is also where I think I find myself wondering about or learning from my experiences in the Balkans too. And especially Macedonia, especially that trip to Skopje with you, where I could see like a people being shot on by, all of these layers of history. And again, I see it as very literally a kind of trampling, right, of these different, invaders, colonizers, empires occupying the space. So it'd be interesting to think about where and how Jose's very specific notion of the Brown Commons might travel to a place like North Macedonia. What I also hear in the passage you read, this is something I'm wanting to keep thinking about, is where and how the Brown Commons is very closely in a kind of proximate or familial or cousin-like relation to Indigenous and Indigenous commons. That because brownness is historically in the US is also very tied to questions of indigeneity and the native that are very present for me here in Canada. So one of the ways in which I've been trying to think through this kind of convergence of thinking that I've done over time in and around questions of affect in conversation with people like Jose and Lauren is through questions of indigeneity and Indigenous sovereignty. And again, Lauren and I, it's so interesting that she's here in some capacity. I assume she's like behind the little square I'm seeing, because this, you really are seeing, you know, sort of perform some of the discussions that we've been having of late. That I've been thinking about this through a queer Indigenous writer, poet named Billy Ray Belcourt, who I was gonna hold the book up because I was hoping I could squeeze it in. It's a really beautiful cover. So this is a new book called A History of My Brief Body. Here's the title. I think it's mirrored on the screen, sorry. And he also has 2 volumes of poetry. One is called This Wound is a World, and another one is called NDN Coping Mechanisms. And he does a beautiful mashup of all of our work, taking it into an Indigenous context to talk about a kind of commons of loneliness. So where the Indigenous connection is through the persistent experience of being targeted for destruction, whether that be the legacy of settler colonialism, the legacy of the Indian residential schools, which were a mechanism for stripping people of land, of language, of culture. And even in this time of Indigenous resurgence, the statistics in Canada, for example, on what are called missing and murdered Indigenous women who are dying at disproportionate rates, often through some of the same mechanisms you see in the US, that is police harassment, medical neglect, imprisonment, arrest for sex work or for drug addiction, that there are high rates of death even in the 21st century for Indigenous women. And then the rates of suicide for young Indigenous youth in Canada are also just through the roof. So that is a place from which to think, like, what would a Brown Commons be? In which, as you kind of also the passage you read makes clear, is this close relation of the human and non-human that comes up in Indigenous ways of knowing as well.
Yes.
And the connection to land, the connection to environment, which I don't see as being the exclusive prerogative of Indigenous peoples, but it's something that comes into view very quickly if you are paying attention to those modes of knowing. And so that's kind of how I'm reading Jose's specific work on the Brown Commons right now, is through that lens. And I do find it to be very inspiring. I think as this, kind of Saint Jose, like hagiographic sign in the march suggests, but I'm raised Catholic, so with some Orthodox connections, so I'm all for a good icon, especially a queer one. So I think it's kind of okay to fetishize his work in that way posthumously. Okay, those are some thoughts, and that's my little seminar riff.
because we are kind of up till the end of the time we've planned, I would like to get with two questions that we've received in the comments, if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
The first question comes from Kendall Joe Gertz, if I'm pronouncing the surname right. My apologies if not. So Kendall says, and would you say more about writing during the pandemic? Who you write with? Why those people? How they contributed to what got written? What it feels like to write in these times?
Mm.
That is the first question from Kendall. And another one from Sylvia Sadzinski, who I think you already had the occasion to meet on our summer school in Belgrade. So Sylvia asks, thank you so much for this. Regarding the silver linings of the pandemic, do you think that the visibility of depression or bad feelings and the public compassion, recognition, acknowledgement of this could be one of them too? One of the silver linings, I assume. So yeah, maybe you can briefly, I don't know, say something about both of these questions before we move on to closing.
Sure. Yeah. Just I'll try to be quick because I know we're up against the clock. But writing during the pandemic, it's a little bit been my revenge for feeling isolated and far away, and also tied to an administrative job. And so I've been writing with the Public Feelings group. I've also been writing with one of my former colleagues and good friends in Austin, just one-on-one. And then I also have a kind of a group of queer writers, two others, one who has written young adult fiction, the other who does performance in New York. So quite different from my modes of writing. And we've been connecting via Google Docs for a few years now. I just want to say no shame, no blame. That is, if you can't write during the pandemic, that is totally fine. And again, for me, it's just been a way of having a daily practice, which has been stabilizing for me. But this kind of speaks to the second question as well. These are the things that I have to do anyway to survive. So for me, the pandemic has just kind of been business as usual. And so those of us who may, struggle with what gets called in the mainstream world, issues of mental health, it's like, it's the same old, we're trying to live on as best we can. And so, yes, it's interesting, the language of depression and anxiety and mental health diagnosis in relation to the pandemic. I do watch those mainstream news stories with interest. Again, to some extent, it seems to me to be more of the same. That is, there's a perpetual tendency to try to name through a diagnostic category what I think of as a systemic structure of dealing for conditions of capitalism, racism, etc. And it's a constant struggle as to whether, it's another sort of COVID silver lining conundrum as to whether that's going to be a useful way to crack open what needs to crack open. Just I'll, go back to this notion of the brokenness, different kinds of brokenness. I think both of us you and I, Slavcho, would want to sort of embrace the broken for what it has to offer, at the same time as, I know there to be some specific kinds of brokenness that you are grappling with in North Macedonia that are quite severe and different from some of the things I'm dealing with. And again, it's the same issue of, is it useful to look at those material and structural conditions through the lens of an affective demeanor and an effort to sort of move our feelings around as a way to move the world around. I wish we had more time to unpack that.
Yes, if you're not too tired, maybe, because I wouldn't like, there are a lot of greetings and thanking you in the comments, but maybe just one more last question from Yun Yong Yang. So I'm so glad to be here. Thank you all. I would also like to ask how pandemic and lockdown has influenced the dialectics of hope and despair, maybe on a personal level. Also, how could this dialectic or perhaps ambivalence be expanded to imagine different forms of digital activism of our time? If it's not too late.
Yeah, thanks for coming around to that. And in fact, yeah, so I started with this notion of dialectics and hope, of hope and despair. I sort of named my homage to a sort of classical, perhaps even orthodox Marxist theory, right? Which always also feels very interesting for me to do with an audience in, say, the Balkans, Macedonia, former Eastern Europe, whatever. So what is our relation to Marx from our different locations around the globe? And I've been needing to think about this issue of the relation between COVID silver linings as a kind of mainstream household world and this notion of dialectics of hope and despair, which I think also is a kind of placeholder for the impossibility, really, of being able to think those categories together without inventing new vocabularies. This is something we discussed actually at our last public feelings meeting, where I realized I was in the take 2 on COVID silver linings. I was using more than I think was useful the categories of hope and despair, although I think the work that Jose with Lisa Dugan has done with the category of hope is very interesting, but it's become very fraught, though, that category hope. Again, there's lots of bibliography. For me, also Raymond Williams, Resources of Hope. But it's a term that's gotten taken up. So this is where I think too, this is why I'm interested in a kind of writing practice that would, rather than dialing up to the meta-theoretical level of dialectics and hope and despair, would kind of stay on the ground with, if you're talking about digital media, like sort of telling a story of, well, what's going on for you in the work that you are doing, and where is it that you are able to find some room for mobility or connection or whatever it is within conditions that are, whether pandemic or no pandemic, often very harsh for us right now. Yeah, so that's where a kind of invention of vocabularies, specificity of storytelling is for me interesting as a way of trading information about how it is that we are figuring out resources for survival or for living on.
Super. Okay, so yeah, we are already out an hour and 40 minutes of our time, and I would like to thank you incredibly for agreeing to join us here and to offer us this incredible talk. It is such a pity that these times present an obstacle to be in live together, to have you maybe soon again in Skopje or in Belgrade.
Yeah.
And have some great time, and maybe continue our talks in public, in live with audiences here. And yes, I would like to thank everybody for watching us. We had a great audience this night. More than 100 people were actively following the talk. Right. So I think that everybody is pleasant, and I'm sorry if I've missed some of the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be all from me. So, and if you have something to say in the end.
No, I'm sorry, I'm a bit blind to the questions, because I do love to see the chats and the questions, and who knows, maybe we can organize a smaller Q&A of some kind in the new year if we want to continue it as a conversation.
We'll be definitely having here a circle of and a group of discussion for also the text you proposed in advance for the school participants concretely. So yes, I'm sure there are a lot of issues will be raised during those talks.
Wonderful. Okay, well, it's wonderful to see you even under these conditions. I'm imagining myself there. So thank you.
Have a good evening. Have a good day actually there.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, everybody.